The white-hot pillar of fire and pressurized steam from the destroyed western node punched through the perpetual toxic smog of the low sector, illuminating the jagged metal skyline like a temporary, dying star. Sealers lay flat in the wet, chemical-soaked mud, his forearms covering his head as a hail of pulverized concrete and melted synthetic insulation rained down around them. Shockwave had rippled through the earth, a visceral, teeth-rattling thrum that made the subterranean foundations of the slums groan in structural agony. Beside him, Mara was already pulling herself up, her heavy industrial prosthetic arm sparking violently where a stray electrical arc had clipped the secondary grounding wire. Her mechanical eye spun in frantic, erratic circles, trying and failing to recalibrate its light sensors against the brilliant, fading glare of the explosion. "Get up, Sealers." "Move your legs," Mara screamed, her voice competing with the secondary detonations ripping through the connected pipeline network. The automated suppression systems are completely dead, but the thermal signature from this blast is bright enough to be seen from the upper orbital platforms. The corporate network doesn't need sensors to know we just tore out their throat. Sealers pushed himself off the ground, coughing violently as the thick, sulfurous smoke rolled over their position. His hands were shaking, covered in a slick mixture of grease, grime, and cold rainwater, but his grip on his jacket pocket never slipped. The tarnished cylindrical data capsule was still there, pulsing with a low, rhythmic amber warmth that felt remarkably like a living heartbeat against his ribs. He looked back at the ruins of the bunker. The massive containment dome had collapsed inward, its thick steel plating warped and twisted like melting wax. Billowing clouds of superheated geothermal gas hissed into the cold night air, creating an artificial fog that completely obscured the surrounding alleys. Out of that blinding veil of white steam, a tall, commanding silhouette emerged. The vampire walked with a terrifying, slow deliberation, entirely unbothered by the chaos around him. His tattered black cloak drifted behind him like frozen smoke, and though his clothes were singed and coated in dark soot, his pale skin remained completely unblemished. In his right hand, the Eclipse blade hung silently, its jagged midnight black glass blade absorbing the residual glare of the fires rather than reflecting it. The thick, crystallized artery of crimson light running down the center of the greatsword throbbed in perfect, rhythmic synchronization with a ragged, permanent scar across his chest. "The western sector is dark," the vampire stated, his low baritone vibrating with a cold, triumphant finality that seemed to cut right through the roar of the burning pipelines. "The synthetic current has been bleeding out into the bedrock for 3 miles in every direction. For the first time since the Great Alignment, the corporate gods are tasting the void." Sealers turned his gaze toward the towering metal landscape of the slums. The transformation was staggering. The oppressive, blinding neon grids that had illuminated the misery of the low sector for his entire life had been completely extinguished. The massive, floating holographic billboards that constantly broadcast corporate propaganda, reminding the citizens to remain compliant, to buy their neurological dampeners, to report independent thoughts, had dissolved into empty black air. But it wasn't just the lack of light that struck Sealers. It was the quality of the atmosphere itself. The constant high-frequency digital hum that had vibrated inside his skull since the day he was born, the artificial signal that kept humanity's minds locked in a state of permanent, docile submission, had vanished. The silence was deafening. It was an absolute, uncorrupted emptiness that left a strange, metallic taste on Sealers' tongue. "Listen," Sealers whispered, his voice catching in his throat as he raised a hand to quiet Mara. From the pitch-black depths of the surrounding shanties, from the hollowed-out shipping containers and the narrow utility trenches, a sound was beginning to rise. It started as a low, fractured murmur, the confused, terrified whispers of thousands of human beings suddenly waking up from a lifelong dream. For blocks, people were stumbling out into the mud-slicked alleys, pulling back their tattered hoods, and staring up at the empty, dark sky with wide, unlinked eyes. Their neck implants, usually glowing with a sharp, network-controlled blue light, were completely dead and dark. Then, the whispers began to coalesce. The confusion warped into an absolute, primal realization of their own existence. A lone voice screamed out in defiance from a high scrap-iron balcony, followed by another, and then another. Within moments, the dark alleys erupted into a chaotic, swelling chorus of human sound, a raw, unscripted chant of a populace that had finally realized their masters were capable of bleeding. "They are waking up," Mara murmured, her organic eye widening as she watched the sea of people beginning to swarm the dark thoroughfares. They're actually waking up, sealers. They're tearing down the automated transit gates. They are realizing they have hands, the vampire corrected, his crimson eyes tracking the sudden, violent movements of the crowd with an expression of grim satisfaction. But their awakening is fragile, sealers. Right now, they are driven by raw instinct and a sudden rush of long-suppressed emotion. If we do not give them an anchor, if we do not provide a structured target for this rage, the network will simply wait for the secondary backup arrays to fire up in the mid-sector, re-establish the psychic tether, and execute a sector-wide purge that will reduce these slums to a mass grave. He's right, Sealers said, his mind rapidly shifting back into the analytical, survival-driven framework that had kept him alive as a scavenger. He pulled the data capsule from his pocket, staring at the golden geometric lines that were now permanently etched into his understanding of the city's layout. The western node was just a buffer. The primary transmitter inside the sanctum of the first core is already generating a massive code correction script to override the local blackout. If we don't move into the deep tunnels to meet the Shadow Walkers now, we'll be caught in the open when the Seraphim Guard deploys their airborne containment divisions. Then follow me, Mara said, her mechanical arm clicking into a locked position as she turned toward a heavy, reinforced iron drainage grate embedded in the foundation of a nearby concrete retaining wall. The Shadow Walkers don't live in the standard slums. They occupy the sub-7th abyss, the actual archaeological layer where the modern corporate foundations meet the ancient Tartarian bedrock. Network couldn't lay their fiber optic lines down there because the stone actively scrambles their digital frequencies. She gripped the edge of the heavy iron grate with her synthetic fist, her hydraulic servos whining with a high-pitched stress note as she violently wrenched the metal frame free from its concrete housing, tossing it into the mud with a heavy clatter. A blast of freezing, stagnant air rushed out of the dark opening, carrying the distinct, ancient scent of petrichor, wet granite, and old copper. The vampire stepped forward, his heavy cloak brushing against Sealers as he peered into the absolute blackness of the vertical shaft. The scent of the deep earth, he whispered, a rare, haunting note of nostalgia creeping into his aristocratic features. It remains untainted by their chrome. Proceed, Tech Smith. Let us see if the outcasts of this era still possess the iron of their ancestors. Mara slid into the opening first, her mechanical arm providing a steady anchor as she disappeared into the subterranean gloom. Sealers followed immediately, his boots finding the slick, rusted iron rungs of an ancient maintenance ladder that descended into the unknown. The vampire came last, dropping into the vertical shaft with absolute silence, his tattered cloak billowing around him like a protective shroud of darkness. The descent took what felt like hours. The air grew steadily colder, stripping away the chemical warmth of the surface slums and replacing it with an intense, heavy dampness that clung to Sealers' clothes. The modern infrastructure, the plastic-coated cables, the humming waste pipes, the synthetic rubber conduits, gradually thinned out, replaced by massive, monolithic blocks of unpolished black granite that were entirely devoid of corporate serial numbers or digital markings. This was the buried world, the literal foundation upon which the elites had constructed their neon prison. As Sealers' boots finally hit the solid stone floor at the bottom of the ladder, he found himself standing in a colossal subterranean avenue. The scale of the architecture was breathtaking. The vaulted ceilings rose dozens of feet above them, carved from the living rock with perfect, mathematically precise geometric angles that predated the modern era by centuries. Massive square pillars of black basalt lined the avenue, their surfaces etched with deep, faded runes that looked identical to the configurations carved into the Eclipse blade. "This is the Tartarian Highway," the vampire said, his voice echoing through the vast chamber with a rich, resonant depth. He walked past Sealers, his long fingers gently tracing the faded runes on the nearest pillar. As his skin made contact with the stone, the runes flared with a faint, ghostly crimson light, answering the pulse of his chest scar. "My people constructed these avenues to channel the natural electromagnetic ley lines of the planet. We did not require wires, Sealers. We lived in harmony with the frequency of the creation. The corporate gods buried this place because they could not understand a power that could not be metered, packaged, and sold to a captive populace." "They didn't just bury it," Mara said, leading them down the wide stone avenue toward a distant, flickering light. They tried to flood it with toxic waste from the upper chemical plants 50 years ago to wipe out the early resistance factions. That's how the Shadow Walkers were born. The survivors of that purge had to modify their bodies not with clean, corporate chrome, but with scavenged industrial machinery and old Tartarian copper just to filter the poisoned air. As they neared the end of the avenue, the distant light resolved into a massive, iron-framed outpost constructed inside the ruins of an ancient amphitheater. Hundreds of makeshift dwellings were built directly into the tiered stone seating, illuminated by the low, smokeless blue flames of ancient geothermal braziers. But these citizens didn't look like the broken, docile inhabitants of the surface slums. Dozens of figures stood perched along the iron scaffolding and the stone parapets, their bodies heavily wrapped in dense leather cloaks and primitive respirators. Their cybernetic modifications were brutal and industrial, massive, exposed gears turning along their spines, external respiratory bellows pumping rhythmically against their rib cages, and heavy, copper-shielded optical lenses that glowed with a dull, menacing amber. They didn't possess network registry ports. Their skulls were completely covered by heavy metal plating designed to deflect the corporate psychic frequencies. The moment the vampire stepped into the light of the amphitheater, a sharp, metallic click echoed through the vast space. Dozens of long, heavy-barreled rifles, forged from thick industrial pipes and modified with Tartarian compression chambers, were instantly leveled at the trio from the surrounding ledges. "Hold your fire, it's Mara." The techsmith yelled, raising her mechanical arm in a universal gesture of peace. "I've brought the key, and I've brought the one who can lead us out of the dark." A heavy, absolute silence fell over the amphitheater, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical wheezing of the outcast's external lung bellows. From the center of the tiered seating, a towering figure slowly stepped forward, descending the stone steps with a heavy, metallic clatter. It was a man whose body had been almost entirely claimed by the machines of the deep. His left torso and arm were encased in a massive frame of unpolished bronze and exposed pistons, and his face was entirely obscured by a heavy iron welding mask with 3 glowing amber lenses arranged in a vertical line down the center. He carried a massive, industrial pneumatic hammer over his broad shoulder, the tool whistling with a constant, low-pressure leak. Mara, the leader's voice, boomed through a mechanical vocal synthesizer, the sound deep, grating, and completely devoid of human inflection. The blind grids across the 7th circle are screaming with static. The wire says the surface is blacked out, and the enforcers are mobilizing their heavy divisions. You were supposed to bring data, Tech Smith. Instead, you drag a surface scavenger and a ghost from the archives into our final sanctuary. Leader's amber lenses shifted down, locking onto the vampire's pale face and the massive, midnight black hilt protruding from beneath his cloak. "We know what you are, immortal. The historical fragments left in our databanks remember the kings of old. You ruled from your golden domes while our ancestors labored in the dirt. Why should the Shadow Walkers bleed for a tyrant who has spent the last 5 centuries hiding in the sewers while we died in the waste?" The vampire did not flinch. He stepped out in front of Mara and Sealers, his tall frame radiating a cold, unyielding majesty that seemed to dwarf the towering mechanical leader. He did not draw his blade, but he let his heavy cloak fall back, exposing the ragged, glowing scar on his chest to the entire assembly. "I did not hide because I feared their weapons, Metal Man," the vampire declared, his thundering voice easily overwhelming the leader's vocal synthesizer. "I hid because I was broken by the same poison that binds your flesh today, the poison of betrayal. 500 years ago, I trusted a mortal with the secrets of our architecture. I offered him the gift of eternity, and in return, he plunged a relic weapon into my chest and sold this world to the parasites who rule the sky. I lost my kingdom, I lost my people, and I lost my willingness to fight for a species that could be so easily bought for a taste of synthetic power." Vampire took a slow, deliberate step toward the leader, his crimson eyes burning with an intense, predatory fire. "But today, a child of your dirt, a boy who has known nothing but the scraps of your neon prison, threw himself before a tactical containment unit to protect my life. He did not ask for a throne. He did not ask for chrome. He chose the path of the mind because he refused to spend the rest of his life dying like a rat in the pipes. If a scavenger from the mud can find the strength to face the heavens, then the last king of the shadows has no excuse to remain in the dark." He raised his right hand, his long fingers wrapping around the hilt of the Eclipse blade. With a swift, fluid motion, he drew the greatsword. The black glass blade cut through the cold air with a sharp, singing whistle, the crystallized crimson vein inside flaring into a brilliant, blinding light that cast a deep, red hue across the entire amphitheater. The outcasts along the ledges let out a collective, mechanical gasp, their amber lenses spinning furiously as their tactical sensors registered the absolute, unquantifiable energy signature of the ancient relic. "Do not offer you a new master," the vampire said, lowering the tip of the blade until it rested silently against the granite floor. "I offer you an edge. The Eclipse blade has returned, and it is hungry for the blood of the weakened gods. The Western Node was merely a demonstration. If you give me your iron, if you provide the tactical depth to navigate their subterranean defenses, I will lead you directly into the sanctum of the First Core, and we will shatter their psychic prison forever." Mechanical Leader stood perfectly still, the three amber lenses of his iron mask tracking the slow, rhythmic pulse of the red light radiating from the sword. His pneumatic hammer hissed quietly as he lowered it to the stone floor, his massive bronze hand resting against the hilt. "Words of a king are easy to speak," the leader rumbled through his synthesizer, "but the sanctum is not just protected by soldiers. It is governed by the Prime Matrix, an ancient, adaptive algorithm that simulates reality itself to intercept any physical or digital intrusion. To reach the core, our forces must pass through the Great Sluice Gate, a massive hydraulic barrier controlled by a three-key cryptographic vault lock. The keys are not physical, sire. They are algorithmic. They require a mind capable of interfacing with an unencrypted Tartarian processing terminal without being driven insane by the raw, unfiltered data flux." Leader turned his amber lenses toward Sealers, his mechanical arm gesturing to a massive, ancient bronze structure embedded in the center of the amphitheater's stage. It looked like a cross between a colossal clockwork mechanism and a sacrificial altar, its surface covered in intricate, spinning rings of brass and silver dials that were currently dark and silent. "Your Vampire King has shown us his steel," the leader stated coldly. "Now, let us see if the Surface Boy truly possesses the mind he claims to have chosen. That terminal is the primary interface for the sub-7th hydraulic lines. If he can manually align the cryptographic rings and open the sluice gate without shorting out his own nervous system, we will believe your covenant. If he fails, his brain will melt inside his skull, and we will bury you both in the granite." Mara stepped forward, her face etched with panic. "Lork, that interface hasn't been successfully cleared in 3 generations. The data flux is completely raw. It's the unfiltered electromagnetic frequency of the Earth's crust. A surface human without a shielded neural harness can't handle that kind of load." "He chose the path of the mind," the vampire said quietly, his crimson eyes turning down to Sealers with an expression of calm, unyielding expectation. "Let him prove that the mind is more than the wires they gave him." Sealers felt the cold sweat tracing down his spine. He looked at the massive bronze terminal, then down at the data capsule in his hand. He could feel the eyes of hundreds of outcasts locking onto him from the darkness, their mechanical breathers creating a rhythmic, suffocating pressure in the air. He was just a scavenger from the 7th sector. He had survived by fixing cheap circuit boards and dodging security drones. He didn't have a shielded harness. He didn't have corporate implants. But as he stared at the spinning brass rings of the ancient terminal, he realized something that made his heart stabilize. The corporate interfaces he had spent his life hacking were designed to be complicated. They were built with layers of artificial encryption meant to keep people out. But this architecture, this Tartarian engineering, wasn't built to exclude. It was built to connect. It was geometric. It was natural. "I'm ready," Sealers said, his voice remarkably clear and steady. He walked past the vampire, stepping onto the stone stage and approaching the colossal bronze altar. Up close, the machine was magnificent. The interlocking gears were forged from solid, untarnished brass, and the central interface consisted of 3 concentric rings of polished silver, each etched with the same geometric constellations he had seen on the vault door in the catacombs. Sealers took a deep breath, centering his mind. He didn't look for a data port. He didn't try to find a digital screen. Instead, he reached into his jacket, withdrawing the tarnished cylindrical data capsule and placed it directly into the circular recess at the top of the terminal. The response was instantaneous. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the altar as the internal gears engaged. Suddenly, the three concentric silver rings began to spin violently, creating a high-pitched, singing whistle that filled the amphitheater. A wave of raw, unfiltered electromagnetic energy surged upward from the floorboards, tearing through Silas's boots and radiating up his legs like a localized lightning strike. Silas let out a strangled gasp, his vision instantly exploding into a blinding kaleidoscope of brilliant, golden geometric patterns. The pain was staggering. It felt as though his very consciousness was being violently stretched across a vast, infinite grid of pure light. He could feel the weight of the entire Earth's crust pressing down on his mind, the chaotic, roaring data of the geothermal ley lines flooding his sensory cortex all at once. "Disconnect," a voice screamed inside his head, his own primal survival instinct begging him to pull his hands away before his brain fried. But Silas refused to break. He leaned into the pain, forcing his mind to look past the overwhelming noise of the data flux. He began to apply the analytical logic he had developed as a scavenger. He didn't try to fight the current. He began to organize it. In his mind's eye, the chaotic golden lines began to resolve into the familiar, three-dimensional geometric map he had seen in the vault. He recognized the pattern. It was a lock, and the stars etched into the silver rings were the coordinates. His hands moved automatically, his fingers wrapping around the outer silver ring. The metal was burning hot, threatening to blister his skin, but he didn't care. He twisted the outer ring clockwise, aligning the first constellation with the alignment mark on the bronze frame. A heavy, mechanical thud boomed deep beneath the floorboards. 1. The data flux intensified, a surge of white-hot static tearing behind his eyes that made his nose begin to slowly bleed. His vision blurred, the faces of the vampire and Mara dissolving into the gold glare. But Silas remained locked in his focus. He reached for the middle ring, his muscles twitching with uncontrollable tremors as the electrical current scrambled his motor controls. He forced his hand to steady, wrenching the middle ring counterclockwise until the second constellation clicked into place. Another massive thud shook the amphitheater. 2. His biometrics are spiking into the red, Mara yelled from the stage floor, her mechanical eyes spinning frantically as she monitored the static leakage around the altar. "He's going to code lock. Lork, shut it down." "No," the vampire commanded, his voice a wall of iron that stopped Mara in her tracks. "He is rewriting the code. Look at the rings." Silas was down to the final, smallest silver ring. The pressure inside his skull was immense, a deafening, roaring wind that felt like a timeline shifting within his own memories. He could see flashes of his past, the cold, hungry nights in the slums, the fear of the enforcers, the hopeless routine of scavenging in the ruins. But those memories were no longer dampening his spirit. They were the fuel. He was the mind that had survived the machine. With a final, screaming exertion of absolute willpower, Silas slammed his palm against the inner ring, forcing it into its final alignment coordinate. A sound like an atmospheric detonation ripped through the sub-seventh abyss. The spinning rings instantly froze in place, locking together with a thunderous metallic crash. The blinding golden glare vanished from Silas's vision, replaced by a deep, steady amber glow that emanated from the center of the altar. Silas collapsed forward, catching himself against the bronze frame as he coughed violently, a thin line of dark blood dripping from his nose onto the polished metal. But as he looked up through his blurred vision, he saw that the massive stone wall at the rear of the amphitheater was slowly splitting apart. Two colossal hydraulic cylinders, each the size of a corporate transport ship, groaned as they compressed, dragging the massive granite sluice gate upward into the ceiling. The path into the deep underbelly of the midsector was wide open. The outcasts along the ledges stood in absolute, stunned silence. The mechanical leader, Lork, stared at the open gate, his vertical amber lenses clicking through a dozen different diagnostic spectrums as he confirmed the total absence of a system alert on the grid. Silas had bypassed the algorithm cleanly, leaving no digital footprint for the corporate network to track. Lork slowly turned back to the stage, looking at the exhausted human boy who was still standing by the altar, then up at the ancient vampire king, whose blade continued to pulse with a dark, satisfied crimson light. Slowly, deliberately, the mechanical leader raised his massive bronze arm, bringing his heavy pneumatic hammer down against the stone floor in a single, thundering strike of absolute salute. Behind him, hundreds of outcasts followed suit, slamming their rifles and tools against the stone parapets in a deafening, rhythmic cadence that shook the very foundations of the abyss. The unlinked legion had found its leaders. "The gate is open, King," Lork rumbled, his vocal synthesizer dropping into a tone of genuine, mechanical reverence. "The Shadow Walkers are yours. Tell us where we pour our iron." The vampire stepped up beside Sealers, placing a cold, heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. The support was subtle, but it gave Sealers the strength to stand completely upright, wiping the blood from his lip as he looked out at the army they had just forged in the dark. "We do not waste time on the borders," the vampire declared, pointing the tip of the Eclipse blade through the open sluice gate into the deep, dark tunnels ahead. "The network is scrambling to re-establish their connection. We march through the hydraulic transit shafts tonight, and we strike the mid-sector distribution hub before the sun rises on their blind spires. We are going to rip their heaven down." But before the Legion could even take their first step into the newly opened passage, a sharp, piercing alarm suddenly cracked through Mara's handheld data receiver. The silver data spike she had pulled from her old workshop began to flash with a volatile, strobing purple glare. Mara looked down at the interface, her face draining of what little color it had left. "Sealers, sire, it's the Supreme Commander." He didn't wait for the backup arrays to fire up. "What is he doing?" Sealers asked, a sudden dread ice-locking his chest. "He initiated a total timeline purge across the 7th sector," Mara whispered, her voice trembling with absolute horror. "They're using the primary transmitter inside the sanctum to broadcast a high-frequency neurological wipe. They aren't trying to fix the blackout anymore, Sealers. They are systematically frying the brains of every single resident in the low sector to ensure the infection of independent thought doesn't spread to the upper levels. 50,000 people are going to die in 10 minutes if we don't shut that transmitter down right now." The vampire's crimson eyes flared into a brilliant, dangerous eruption of light, his jaw setting in a hard, dangerous line as he looked at the path ahead. The war hadn't just accelerated, it had become a race against the literal extinction of their army's home. "Then we do not march," the vampire roared, his voice commanding the entire, unlinked legion into immediate, furious motion. "We run."